Hi guys, my name is John and today we'll delve into the case of a girl who vanished from her bedroom in the middle of the night. As the police started their search, they encountered a series of unexpected twists that no one could have predicted. Eventually, the detectives managed to uncover the truth about the girl's fate, but no one was ready for it. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998 in San Diego, California. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother, Colleen, moved with her to a small town called Stella in Missouri. Later, her mom met a man named David, and they got married. Colleen had several children from a previous marriage, and soon after their wedding, she and David had a daughter together. Altogether, Rowan had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, and they shared a very close bond. She spent a lot of time outdoors riding her bike around town, enjoying swimming, and indulging in her passion for drawing. She also liked going to Sunday school at the local church, where she always volunteered to help other kids who had some issues with their tasks. In November 2007, when Rowan was 9 years old, she was in the 4th grade at the local elementary school. Her mom worked the night shift at a store, while her stepdad spent most of the day on the farm. This left Rowan often fending for herself, which made her very independent. On November 2nd, she stayed home alone as usual. Her mom went to work, and her stepdad hadn't returned from the farm yet. The next morning, around 9 a.m., Colleen came home from her night shift and checked Rowan's room. But her daughter wasn't there. She asked her husband where her daughter was. He said she had asked him if she could have a sleepover at a friend's house, and he had let her go. He didn't even ask the friend's name because their town was very small, and he wasn't worried about anything happening to her. But Colleen started to worry and decided to check with all of Rowan's friends. Since there were only a few streets in their town, it didn't take long. But none of them had seen her, and she hadn't stayed over at any of their houses, which made her mother even more concerned. Colleen searched the whole town but couldn't find her daughter. She went back home and told her husband that Rowan was nowhere to be found. She asked him to call the police and report her missing, but he reassured her that everything was fine and that she would come home soon. After waiting for several more hours with no sign of Rowan, Colleen took matters into her own hands and dialed 911 herself. The local sheriff immediately organized a search operation. He went to their house to speak with David, as he was the last person to see Rowan before she disappeared. David said that on that evening, while he was working on the farm with his colleague, Christopher, their mutual friend, Nathan, came by. They all decided to go to David's place to have some drinks and play pool. They stopped by the store, bought some alcohol, and went to David's house where they spent several hours. Later in the night, Christopher asked Nathan to drive him home to the neighboring town where his trailer was, and they persuaded David to join them to continue the fun. Before leaving the house, he checked on Rowan in her room. Seeing that she was asleep, David left with his friends. They stopped by the store again, grabbed more alcohol, and headed to Christopher's trailer, where they continued drinking for about an hour. After that, David decided to head home and asked Nathan to give him a ride. Nathan agreed but chose to take back roads instead of the main highway. By that time, he was quite drunk and didn't want to risk encountering the police. Nathan dropped him off and drove home, while David went straight to bed. Soon after, he was awakened by Rowan, who asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house. Without much thought, he agreed and fell back asleep. Police approached this story with some skepticism. What puzzled them most was the fact that a 9-year-old girl decided to go to her friend's house in the middle of the night, and her stepfather let her go without even asking which friend she was talking about. The sheriff considered that David might be hiding something or directly involved in Rowan's disappearance, but he had no evidence to support this theory. Police searched the town and its surroundings until late at night. Local residents immediately joined the search as they all knew Rowan's family and wanted to help. The population of Stella was only about 150 people, so news of her disappearance spread throughout the county almost instantly. People were used to being able to let their children play outside without a worry, as nothing ever happened in such a quiet place. But now, when Rowan vanished without a trace and the police were unable to find her for a whole day, the residents of Stella were in a state of panic. The first day of the search yielded no results. On November 4th, the police went to the neighboring town to speak with Christopher, who fully corroborated David's story. However, Christopher added that his friend hadn't even contacted him since that evening and he had only just found out about Rowan's disappearance. On the same day, the police expanded the search and involved even more volunteers, but they still couldn't find Rowan or any clues to her whereabouts. The next morning, the FBI joined the investigation. While the local police continued to search for Rowan throughout the town and its surroundings, detectives focused on exploring the possibility of abduction. They strongly doubted the stepfather's story as it seemed highly questionable. Police also checked with all of Rowan's friends and confirmed that she hadn't visited any of them that night. Investigators continued to speak with David and he changed certain details in his story several times, further raising suspicions against him. For instance, he gave conflicting timelines for his absence from home that night, and even said that perhaps Rowan hadn't asked him for permission to go to her friend's house and just left without his knowledge. FBI agents also discovered that on the night of her disappearance, David had asked his mother to borrow her car, a fact he had initially not disclosed to the police. As a result, they decided to seize both this car and his own pickup truck for examination, but experts were unable to uncover any evidence. Meanwhile, detectives decided to speak with Christopher and Nathan again, as they were both with David that evening. Police invited Christopher to the station. He repeated the same story as the day before. He also agreed to a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. Several hours after Christopher left the station and returned to work, he noticed Sheriff Clark's car and waved for him to stop. Sheriff Clark led the police department in their town, called Witten, and had known Christopher for 17 years, since his childhood. The sheriff was friends with his foster parents and Christopher always respected him. He often sought his advice or help in difficult times, such as when his mother passed away. Sheriff Clark approached Christopher and they discussed Rowan's disappearance. The sheriff was aware of the case but had not been involved in it as the search was being handled by the Stella department. He contacted the agents and told them about his concerns. Investigators assumed that Christopher might be withholding some significant information that could implicate Rowan's stepfather in her disappearance. Perhaps he had asked Christopher to lie and change certain details in the story of that evening. And now, Christopher feared being implicated as an accomplice if he told the truth. Sheriff Clark informed the FBI agents that he had a close and trusting relationship with Christopher, so he offered to help persuade him to talk. That same evening, Christopher went to Colleen's house to ask her if there was any progress in the search. About the same time, FBI agents also arrived to speak with Rowan's mother again. When they saw Christopher there, they also asked him some questions, and he once again repeated that the events of that evening unfolded exactly as he had previously said. But then, he mentioned for the first time that he did not rule out the possibility of David's involvement in her disappearance, and said that he wanted to help them uncover the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. He even suggested wearing a wire and going to talk to David to try to coax him into confessing. But at that point, the detectives decided not to resort to such tactics. Instead, they asked Christopher if he had any locations in mind where his friend could have hidden Rowan's body, and he named several places. The next morning, police set out to search these locations, as well as continuing their search in the surrounding areas of Stella. FBI agents once again brought David for questioning, but he repeatedly denied any involvement. Detectives searched his home in an attempt to find any leads, but it turned up nothing. Meanwhile, Christopher went to the sheriff's office to speak with Clark and told him about his encounter with the FBI. During their conversation, the sheriff had a strong feeling that Christopher was still withholding something. After their meeting, he contacted the detectives again and told them that Christopher might be keeping some information that could likely help them prove David's. FBI agents asked the sheriff to continue trying to persuade him to talk. Based on the fact that Christopher had repeatedly contacted Clark to discuss the case with him, they believed he wanted to share important information, but for some reason, he was afraid to do so. The next day, on November 7th, the police called Christopher back to the station. They needed his consent to search his safe, located in David's house. Christopher had been living with him for several months when he temporarily didn't have a place of his own, and some of his belongings were still there. Christopher gave them his permission and also agreed to allow the police to search his trailer and his car. He also voluntarily provided them with a DNA sample, and he agreed to answer the detectives' questions again. They began questioning him about that evening and once again asked him to confirm David's story. But this time, Christopher suddenly admitted that his friend's story wasn't entirely true, and the investigators began pressing him to tell them what really happened. But this pressure only caused Christopher to become agitated. He said that if the police were going to treat him like a criminal and attempt to accuse him of involvement in Rowan's disappearance, he would not continue this conversation. After that, detectives had to end the interrogation, and Christopher left the station. That same evening, he went to Sheriff Clark and told him about it. He complained that the detectives were treating him like a suspect and said that he might need to hire a lawyer. The sheriff replied that it was his right, but asked him to understand that the police were just doing everything possible to find Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that he would no longer speak with them and that if he wanted to share anything else, he would only speak with Clark. The sheriff continued to persuade Christopher to tell him everything he knew, and at some point, Christopher began to cry. He said that he always loved Rowan and would never harm her. During the time when he lived in David's house, he developed a close bond with Rowan and the other children. They began to treat him like a family member and even called him Uncle Christopher. The sheriff understood that Christopher was on the brink of revealing everything he knew. However, just as Christopher was about to speak, someone arrived at the police station, distracting Sheriff Clark for some time. Christopher left the office without sharing what he had intended to. Sheriff Clark reached out to the FBI again and told them about this conversation. He explained that Christopher was almost ready to disclose everything he knew, but cautioned that pushing him too hard might cause him to stop talking and get an attorney. Clark suggested to give Christopher some time to think it over, and the detectives agreed. The search for Rowan continued the next day, again with no luck.
Sheriff Clark
but everything
reached out to
changed
the
on November 9th, a week after her disappearance. Search groups reached a remote area near a town called Powell, 10 miles from Stella. There, amidst fields and trees, they discovered a large pit in the ground. When they looked there, they found Rowan's body, concealed under leaves and debris. She was missing all clothing below the waist, except for one sock. Medical experts found signs of strangulation and also determined that she had been sexually assaulted. Shortly after the body's discovery, FBI agents contacted Sheriff Clark and asked him to speak with Christopher again, hoping he would now reveal everything. Sheriff learned that earlier that morning, Christopher had visited the station when he wasn't there and informed other officers that he needed to speak urgently with Clark. The sheriff set out to search for Christopher, checking all the places where he might be, but the man was nowhere to be found. It continued until Christopher called Clark himself. He was clearly distressed and asked if he was being followed. He explained that after hearing the news about Rowan's body being found, he drove around town to clear his head and noticed a gray car tailing him. Sheriff Clark replied that he knew nothing about any surveillance and suggested meeting Christopher in person. When they met, Christopher was visibly nervous and expressed concern for his safety. He feared that after Rowan's body was discovered, he might be accused of murder and someone might seek revenge against him. Clark took him to the station and said that now, when the case had been classified as a homicide, it was time to reveal everything he knew. Christopher began crying again, and the sheriff asked him to tell what David had done to Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that there were too many people at the police station and he didn't want to discuss it here. He suggested going to a quieter place and mentioned a small bridge located a few miles from their town. Clark agreed, and they drove there together. As they got out of the car, Christopher unexpectedly raised his hands and said that he should handcuff him. The sheriff was surprised and replied that it wasn't necessary, but Christopher said, "After what I tell you, you'll have to do it." After this, he began talking. Christopher repeated the first part of the story he had told the police many times. He, along with Nathan and David, went to his trailer where they continued drinking. Sometime later, his friends decided to head home and David asked Nathan for a ride. They said they would take back roads to avoid the police and left. But then Christopher started telling something that shocked the sheriff to the core. He claimed that he wanted to sexually assault Rowan, and quickly came up with a plan. Knowing his friends would take quite some time on the road through the fields, he got into his car and drove straight to David's house, taking the main highway. He entered Rowan's room, picked her up and carried her to his car, doing it all so that she wouldn't wake up. After that, he took her to his trailer, where he assaulted her. According to him, she only woke up at that moment and tried to resist, but she couldn't break free. Christopher didn't turn on the lights or speak to her because he didn't want Rowan to recognize him. After the crime, he planned to take her back home and leave, but things didn't go as planned. When he carried Rowan out of the trailer, the moon was shining brightly and she saw his face. Christopher panicked, grabbed a rope, and strangled her. When she passed away, he loaded her body into the car and started thinking about what to do next. At first, he wanted to dump her from the bridge, the same one where he stood with Sheriff Clark. But Christopher realized that her body would be found too quickly, so he got behind the wheel and began driving around the county, considering other options. Soon, he remembered the large pit near the neighboring town and headed there. He dumped the body into the pit and tried to cover it with branches, but the pit was too large, so everything fell down. When he returned to the trailer, he found traces of Rowan's blood on his clothes and mattress. Christopher also realized he needed to get rid of her pants, underwear, and the rope he used to kill her. He collected all these items and placed them in a large barrel, intending to burn them. However, Christopher quickly realized that such a fire would definitely attract attention. So he dragged the barrel into the shed, closed the door, and started the fire there. Sheriff Clark was completely taken back by this story. All this time, he thought David had committed the crime, and Christopher was just withholding some information. It was hard for him to believe that the man he had known for almost 20 years was capable of such brutality. Christopher himself had 3 young children, although he didn't live with them after divorcing his wife. He always seemed like a decent man to him, but reality turned out to be way more chilling. After Christopher finished his story, he agreed to voluntarily go to the station, and the sheriff didn't handcuff him. Only after they arrived and the man repeated his confession to the FBI agents, he was arrested on charges of murder. Christopher also signed a voluntary consent to search his trailer and car. Ending his confession, he added that he regretted his actions and said that he cried like a baby all the next day. The detectives immediately went to speak with David and informed him that Christopher had confessed to the murder. Considering David's strange behavior and inconsistent statements, they suspected that he might have been covering for his friend. However, they were met with an even more shocking twist. When David was brought in for questioning, he suddenly changed his version of events. According to him, the night he returned home and found Rowan missing from her room, he realized that Christopher might have taken her. So he took his mother's car and drove to his trailer. Upon entering, he saw the girl on the bed with Christopher leaning over her instead of rescuing Rowan. David decided to join in. He also sexually assaulted her. Then he helped his friend kill her and dispose of the body. David added that during the ordeal, his brain simply shut off and he remembered nothing about the night for several days. The detectives, who were not expecting such a twist, went back to Christopher to confirm David's words. However, Christopher stated that his friend was not involved and that everything happened as he had told them. This further baffled the detectives, but Christopher's story matched the facts. Medical experts confirmed that the victim had been strangled with a thin rope, a detail only the killer would know. During a search of the trailer, the police found a barrel with ashes. In his car, they also discovered hair comparable to Rowan's. Despite investigators still being unable to confidently determine whose version of events was truthful, both men provided incriminating statements. So David was also arrested and their cases were sent to court. During the trial, Christopher filed a motion to exclude all his statements from the case materials, claiming he was unaware they could be used against him and that the police violated his rights. But the judge denied this motion since all his conversations with investigators were entirely voluntary. Christopher also attempted to plead mitigating circumstances, pointing out his difficult childhood. From an early age, he was constantly shuffled between biological and foster parents, which greatly impacted him. Christopher also invited an expert who claimed he had signs of developmental issues, but none of this helped him avoid punishment. In 2012, 5 years after the murder, he was sentenced to death. He tried to appeal this sentence, but to no avail. As for David, the situation was much more complicated. He admitted to assaulting and killing Rowan, but there was one serious problem. His version contradicted Christopher's statements. If the prosecution decided to charge David with murder, it could potentially lead to Christopher's sentence being overturned, and David might also avoid responsibility. Considering there was no solid evidence against David, such as DNA, the prosecution could not take such a risk. In fact, they still weren't sure if he was involved at all. The prosecution did not rule out the possibility that David might have indeed committed the crime together with Christopher, but there was no evidence to support this theory. In the end, a difficult decision was made. To avoid the risk of Christopher's sentence being overturned, they reduced David's charges to much lighter ones. He pleaded guilty to 2 charges, child endangerment and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison, with a minimum of 5 years to be served behind bars. This sentence was met with outrage. If David was indeed involved in the murder, his punishment was deemed incomparable to the severity of the crime. However, there's nothing that can be done about it now, and it's unlikely that he will ever be tried again for this case. As for Christopher, he remains in prison, awaiting execution. Considering that decades often pass between sentencing and execution, there are no guarantees that the death penalty will ever be carried out. It's quite possible that he will simply spend the rest of his life in prison.